as we say in England, oi! Hello, everybody. Lovely to have you all here for this, our next installment in the Humanities Center series on the desert. I want to make a quick promotional pitch for next week's session, which features a very special guest, Ken Lane, author of the fascinating book, Desert Oracle. And it's a podcast, Desert Oracle, devoted to collecting and preserving the weird stories of the desert. So do come for that. But today we turn our attention to a fascinating topic in and of itself, namely the relation of the desert to religion and spirituality. And to lead our session today, I am delighted to introduce two splendid faculty members, each with an abiding interest in the desert and its inspirational qualities. Victor Carmona is Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and Director of USD's core curriculum. Dr. Carmona received his PhD in moral theology from the University of Notre Dame. And a central element of his research is on theological ethical questions concerning immigration and the experience of border communities. The aim of Dr. Carmona's work, explored in a dizzying number of articles, is to draw from the wisdom of the Catholic tradition so as to create more just immigration systems in increasingly pluralistic and interdependent societies. He is president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the US. Alberto Pulido is professor and chair, the founding chair indeed, of the Ethnic Studies Department at USD. He received his PhD also from the University of Notre Dame, where he studied in the Mexican-American Graduate Studies program. Among his many publications and creative projects are the books San Diego Lowriders, A History of Cars and Cruising, and The Sacred World of the Penitentes. And he's also the director and co-producer of the fantastic documentary film, Everything Comes from the Streets. Dr. Pulido is director of the Turning Wheel project, which provides a mobile classroom and creative space, and was developed as a collaboration between USD, the Chicano Park Steering Committee, and the Chicano Park Museum. So please welcome our speakers on religion, spirituality, and the desert, Victor Carmona and Alberto Pulido. Thank you.
I don't think I need the microphone, right? We're okay without the microphone? A little bit? You're okay? I can speak up? All right, good. Just a quick disclaimer that Victor and I both went to Notre Dame, but we don't consider ourselves fighting Irish, we're fighting Mexicans. So I just want to make that clear. And another interesting point is, I started off my career doing a lot of work in religion, and now I'm working on lowriders, so people say I've gone from saints to sinners. Interesting. Anyway, I want to spend most of the time referencing a book that came out quite a long time ago, which has probably been rarely read, Peregrinos de Aztlán by Miguel Méndez, translated into the English, Pilgrims of Aztlán. This came out in the early 70s. Méndez was had 4 years of education, was a bricklayer, a farm worker, and he just had this incredible gift in writing. The University of Arizona gave him an honorary degree, and then he was able to teach at University of Arizona and Pima Community College. And delightful book, very hard to follow because it's not a linear novel. But I want to reference it with regards to larger issues that I'm interested in. And I was invited to write an essay about this, which is kind of what I'm drawing from. So when this opportunity came up to present, I was very excited to do that. Also, this notion of imperialism, I want to speak to the relationship between the United States and Latin American countries, Central America and Mexico, and the sacrality in terms of how somebody like Méndez takes the desert and moves it into something very, very different, which I think has many sacred qualities. And I want to make sure that that word comes up, sacredness, because we said religion and we said spirituality. I think we also need to incorporate the concept of the sacred. So in my training and in my work, we're always contesting space. We're always contesting concepts. You know, our work is deeply rooted in epistemology and how is truth created. And so in following that logic, I want to contest what I have heard a lot in these presentations. And that seems to be sort of the narrative that continually speaks to. And that is where it says, defined as God's mistake and the devil's domain, deserts have largely considered to be uninhabitable wastelands that only a few rugged souls could navigate or be lucky enough to eke out some sort of meager living. So that really kind of stark, harsh understanding of the desert. And then here's Miguel Mendez's first issue of Peregrinos, first came out in Spanish, published in Mexico, later picked up by one of the early Chicano presses, you remember Editorial Justicia, which was from Berkeley. And then here was the edited volume that I contributed in terms of some of the things I want to talk about. So take a moment and reflect on that first sort of quote and perspective about what the desert represents. And then move on, and I'm drawing directly from Mendez. Now, I'm using the English translation. In some sections, I have the Spanish translation. But this is a very different narrative in terms of understanding the desert. This is coming directly from his book. I lost myself among the sand drifts of the Sonoran Desert, seeking him so that he might teach me the language of silence. No more would my soul be wounded by the thorns and scorn of indifference. In the future, I would be a true citizen requesting and receiving justice. I was overtaken by illusion, and I saw in Yuma the cosmic solitude of the Sonoran Desert, the republic that we wetbacks would inhabit, Indians sunk in misfortune and enslaved Chicanos. Our words would be the republic of despised Mexicans. Our house would emerge from the dunes that rise up to look like tombs, and the nomadic race, its feet wounded by centuries of pilgrimage, would finally have a roof crowned by good fortune. From the immensity of the sterile sand, bread would be born like grace. Beautiful. And very much tied to place and race and ethnicity and identity. And this is, to me, sort of a preview of where I'm going with this. This is sort of the end result of what the desert becomes by the end of the novel, and how it has a deeply rooted understanding tied to race, tied to homeland, very much tied to homeland, and for people who are despised or people who are rejected. And he looks at this in a pilgrimage narrative. You know, the fact that you leave a place, you go to a new place, and then you reaggregate, coming back as something different. You've gone through some transformation. In this story, and this is very important to follow, you leave a familiar place and you end up in a familiar place, even though there's movement involved. That's what makes it tricky. It's not that you go to a new place and come back to the familiar, it's the familiar to the familiar. And that's all tied up in terms of why it's called Peregrinos de Aztlán. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Notice also, he's making reference to the sacred, to a sacred being by using the capital him and he in terms of the words. My tío Pascual, who was quite the guy, was a farm worker in Oxnard, always dressed up, and we would go on rides along the border. He would always say this to me: "Los gringos no son pendejos, se chingaron las tierras buenas." Meaning that the gringos were not stupid. They took the good land, the land that was fertile, the land was good. And I bring that up because this is all tied to my conversation. Again, recognizing I'm wanting to present this from an ethnic studies narrative and looking at it from a different point of view. What I have here is simply a map of the Americas with all the indigenous communities and how they're represented. And we have to remember that this space that some people call America, which really need to be looked at as the Americas, has gone through so many changes. And we have to be very sensitive to that. Jumiai, northern Spain, northern Mexico, American Southwest, And it continues to evolve, and I guarantee it'll change again. You know, this very unique part of the world in terms of these ongoing sort of changes. So there's a little bit of a outline over here. My objective is to speak about the power of place in relation to identities and a history of power struggle within the Americas, with the focus on the desert as sacred. I look at 3 historical moments: 1848, 1876, 1969, which then leads us back to pre-conquest 1521, and then some summary reflection. And within this whole discussion, I want to bring up Peregrinos. Movement 1, 1848, 1821, westward expansion, manifest destiny versus US conquest and occupation of the Southwest. We know this region, of course, as northern Mexico. We know westward expansion under the Polk administration, justified by manifest destiny, with interests of getting access to these economic port areas. We know that we have the creation first of Texas as a nation, the Lone Star Republic. We have the annexation, and then we have the famous boundary dispute, where you have Mexicans, soldiers, and US soldiers meeting, and the claim of American blood has been shed on American soil, because there's a debate between the Rio Nueces and the Rio Grande that leads to the war. These territories eventually become the United States, but of course, this is our desert lands right here, right? But they suddenly become now redefined and reclaimed by the US. It now becomes the American Southwest. From an ethnic studies perspective, we want to be open to not looking at this as just a war, where the victor took the land and I don't know what it was, $15 million were paid out. But we want to look at it as a conquest, because we have to look at that ongoing dynamic. If I was talking to people in Mexico, es una invasión norteamericana, not a war. Signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, born of the birth of the American Southwest in the frontera. There were 100,000 people living in the Southwest after the US occupation, and they had a choice to stay or they had a choice to leave. The interesting thing is the ones that stayed got caught up in issues of identity, because the United States had a problem, because if they were going to bring them into the country, they were not white, and you had to be white to be a citizen. So Mexicans get reclassified as white. I'm considered white based on my birth certificate, and it becomes an ethnic category, no longer a racial category. So just wanting to look at all of this in terms of what it means, and how then these lands that were lands of the Americas, lands of the indigenous people, now go up for debate and discussion. Second movement, 1876 to 1910, El Porfiriato and the Mexican Revolution. Highly want to recommend these 2 books here. I'm using them this semester. Harvest of Empires now in its 3rd edition. This is a really, really good book here. Bad Mexicans. The period known as El Porfiriato, when Porfirio Diaz is in power from 1876 to 1910. And it was a period of great prosperity, but it was a period of great prosperity for the few. And the most important thing is that foreign investment was brought into Mexico, Yankee imperialism. And if you read Harvest of Empire, he's making the same argument, but he's making it for Mexico, Guatemala, Salvador, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Panama, Nicaragua, all of those nations. And the reason the book is called Harvest of Empire, because he's making the case that the creation of the empire is what has led to the migration of the thousands coming north, because people's lands have been stripped, people's economy has been ruined. And so therefore, all these conversations around migration have a lot to do with this harvest of empire. As they say, what did they say? The chickens have come to roost now. It's kind of come back in terms of what we have. A wonderful Wonderful theses. What happens with the Porfiriato and what happens with the period of bringing in foreign investment and eventually the revolution of 1910 is the first big wave of migration, right? First major wave. And Hernandez says something really important. These are not migrants, these are refugees, and they need to be looked at as refugees. Tied to the story are the famous Magon brothers, who were anarchists and were political and were challenging the Porfirio Diaz regime. They eventually exiled to the United States and continue to do the work that they do. Very interesting. But all I'm trying to do is show you how then from the territories of the Southwest, now we have migration coming after the territories become the United States. And institutionalize a pattern of interdependency, extraction of resources with the creation of a migrant stream, economic migrants that fulfill a need for unskilled, cheap labor. A couple of quotes from the book that speak to this. They're in Spanish, so hopefully my Spanish is good enough today. Venimos de todos los rumbos del país y queremos cruzar la frontera. Nuestras familias esperan muriéndose de hambre, caminando a pie, amigo. Nomás nos guían las carretas. Uno camina y camina, alentado por la idea de que los gringos son unos dioses o algo así por el estilo. Y que si la tierra esa no hay miseria. Yo vengo de allá, manito. Y si no te desanimo es porque no quiero que vayas a creer que te quiero hacer un mal. No, camarada, vale más que tú te desengañes y lo veas por tú mismo. First one making reference to having to walk, and this is where he gets that notion of the pilgrimage. And the second one is that he's wanting to make sure that he's being honest with this guy, but he doesn't want to discourage him from coming because he wants him to see for himself the problems of this migration movement. So we go from moment one to where people get their lands taken and these families get uprooted to now people actually migrating to a nation that was once theirs. Finally, hundreds of thousands cross the border with the US, and along the way, their voices sow a sort of creeping vines of lamentation, like a rosary of blasphemy, like a ladder of questions without answers, voices born in the bowels of the earth. Men who have inhabited space glued to the earth like the cacti and the corn, shoved along by the vile imperative of food. They all flow out onto the highways, combing the mountains with their bleeding footsteps. They are all on their way to the US as though it was a Mecca for the hungry. Wonderful narrative. Now let's go to the third movement, the birth of the Chicano movement. Just as a summary, post-1848, 100,000 Mexican nationals, post-1910, birth of migration, post-1965, birth of the contemporary Chicano movement, birth of recovery work and counter-narrative revisionist history. This is where we start with the early understanding of ethnic studies struggles. When you have places like San Francisco State shutting down for 3 months in order to get courses like this on the books, it really begins here. The guy in the middle is Corky Gonzalez, someone you probably don't hear a lot about. You hear more about Caesar. Corky's from Denver, Colorado. He runs a group called the Crusade for Justice. And back in '68, he put together a big call for a national Chicano liberation movement. People from all over the country came. And it was that moment when Chicano nationalism really got moving. So that nationalism and that sense of the community forced people to look back. Forced them to look back in their history and started to reimagine spaces. So what do they come up with? Move the discovery and birth of Aslan, the desert of sacred space. So this is a very common image here. That region that was once Mexico now gets redefined as Aztlan. This is the logo of Chicano Park, Aztlan. And I've spent so much time in Chicano Park, I can tell you for the founders, they believe that the park still remains as Aztlan, as political as that statement might be. And the fact that it's land owned by the Caltrans, by San Diego, by the city of San Diego, there is that vision of understanding these territories. The 7 caves, whereby the Mexica people leave, led by Huitzilopochtli in search of Tenochtitlan. The sacred 4 corners here, the Axis Mundi with the eagle on the cactus from the codices that remained, that were not destroyed. So traveling backwards, I like that idea, because you're traveling back to where you're from, reclaiming the desert and reclaiming Aztlan. Quotes from Mendes again. I was overtaken by imagination, and I saw in my pilgrimage many Indian people reduced by the torture of hunger and the humiliation of plunder, traveling backwards along the ancient roads in search of their remote origin. I was overtaken by the enthusiasm of dreaming with my eyes open, and I saw through the wide doors of the unplowed lands, there entered multitudes of Chicano brothers who made paths and roads to peace and tranquility for the immense sandy plains. Their backs went bent, and there were bitterness on their faces and the infinite weariness of slaves. They embraced their Indian forebears, and together they all cry in silence, burying those who have been killed, who are so many that no one can even count them. So my conclusion, peregrinación, this idea of movement ending where we begin, reclamation of the desert, making it our own and creating a sense of space and home. And then one final quote from Miguel Mendes, breaking the silence of the centuries with the agony of our screams. You will see the fields in bloom where you planted your children and trees that have drunk the sap of the ages. Petrified trees without songbirds and without owls. There's where the voices of those who have succumbed dwell. Destiny is history, and history is the road stretched out before the footsteps that have not existed, who have made you believe that you are lambs and beasts of burden. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So let's see. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Oh my gosh, buenas tardes. Hi, everyone. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to add my voice to the ongoing series on the natural landscapes and human meaning, the desert. I'm grateful because while I was born here in San Diego, a proud 3rd-generation San Dieguino, I grew up in Mexicali, an adopted Cachanilla. So I'm a son of both the ocean and the desert. While I continue to learn much from both this afternoon, I'm going to focus on exploring the question of human meaning in light of the experiences and questions that have emerged from encounters at the desert. Now, in preparing for this lecture, I have used my training in theology, a discipline that, quote, when done in a spirit of humility, in the words of Dan Grudy, is a faith seeking understanding that generates knowledge born out of love to offer reflection on what it means to be authentically human in the world. That search for meaning that lies at the heart of the desire to be authentically human is the search to be wholly human, to be whole, to be holy. It is a search for holiness that in the Christian tradition has strong ties to the desert. The title for this afternoon's conversation is Religion, Spirituality, and the Desert. Now, while I will explore the meaning of the desert in light of religion and spirituality, I will change things up a bit to do so I hope you don't mind, and you see the title there. The title of my lecture is Encountering Reality, Spirituality, the Desert, and Religion. I confess that I offer, oh, my students would get a kick out of this. I confess that I offer no thesis statement. Instead, what I bring is simply an honest and ongoing grappling with the temptations that Jesus successfully faced at the desert, but that his disciples in the US appear to have not. And I'm going to share this grappling in 3 moments. So first, a moment on spirituality, second, a moment on the desert, and then finally, a moment on religion. So first moment, spirituality. Like theology, spirituality, including the practice and study of Christian spirituality, but particularly in a Catholic key, has many definitions. For the most part, those definitions emphasize its being about the experience of an ongoing encounter between the practitioner and God, of a relationship that is nurtured through meditation and contemplation in all kinds of prayer. A major challenge in our context is the ongoing assumption that the point of spirituality is the pursuit of an inner peace that has no bearing on reality and our relationship with others. To be blunt, we just had another school shooting yesterday. Statements of, quote, thoughts and prayers, well-intended as they might be, are not a form of Christian spirituality. They have no bearing on reality. Consider instead a definition of spirituality from Peruvian liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, who turns 95 in June. Spirituality, he furthers, is the root of Christian life. It is the knot, quote, where the love of God and the love of neighbor are daily tied together, close quote. It is in that messy reality, particularly in the reality of daily life, which US Latine theologians call lo cotidiano, where we encounter God in contemplation that both nurtures action and is informed by it, that both nurtures love and is informed by it. That is why the practice of spirituality is so demanding. The intimate connection between contemplation and action runs deep in the Christian tradition. Skipping through the centuries, admittedly, we see it in Ignatian spirituality. The founder of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius Loyola, who lived in the 1500s, invites those doing his spiritual exercises to ask for the grace of knowing Jesus more intimately in their prayer, so they may love him more intensely and thus follow him more closely in life. It is an understanding, in turn, that echoes insights from St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine of Hippo, who lived in the 1200s and the 300s, respectively, who in their own ways parse out the insights that knowledge and love of God and love of neighbor are mutually necessary and enriching. Following Ignatius's lead, then, let us turn to Jesus's own experience with contemplation and action. Specifically, let us turn to his experience at the desert and why it matters in Christian spirituality. During Lent, Christians remember the 40-day period that Jesus spent in the desert after John baptized him in the Jordan River. In the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, the author of the Gospel of Matthew writes, quote, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness," the desert in other translations, "to be tested by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished," close quote. At his time in the desert, as his time in the desert is coming to an end, Jesus experiences 3 temptations. One born of hunger. "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to turn into loaves of bread." Another born of pride. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from the pinnacle of the temple and God will command his angels to save you." And a third temptation, born of the desire for power. Showing him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, the devil said to Jesus, "All these I will give you if you fall down and worship me." As biblical scholar Mark Powell writes, at the desert, Jesus rejects, quote, satanic suggestions that would interpret his identity as God's son in ways that would not please God, that would involve his being served rather than serving. This exegete or scholar goes on. Jesus refuses to produce bread miraculously to satisfy his own hunger, though he later will do so to relieve the hunger of others. He rejects the ways of self-aggrandizement or shortcuts to manifest his authority on earth, close quote. Now here I'll be very blunt. When I was a college student, I would intensely focus on the devil and his temptations in this passage. Is the devil real? Is the devil a personification of the reality of evil? But in so doing, I would miss the deeper claim to meaning and truth. That in the desert, Jesus learns to trust that God, who he calls his Father, will provide so that he may proclaim the reign of God in word and deed. That trust, in turn, allows Jesus to see reality more fully so he may act accordingly, freely. It is a trust that allowed him to commit to the hope, in the words of our colleague Orlando Espin, that the compassionate love of God knows no bounds and is indeed active in the world. Following in Jesus's footsteps from the desert, quote, Christianity stands or falls, Espin writes, on the reasonable yet subversive hope that God, as Jesus said, is really intervening in this world, transforming it according to God's compassionate will, close quote. It is a hope that cuts through our understanding of what prayer is and isn't. Now here I'm going to quote Espin at length. He writes, praying is an attitude, a risk, an openness to the mystery we call God. This attitude, risk, and openness are radically anti-idolatrous and radically subversive of all our certainties, because openness to the mystery cannot be programmed or induced. It is literally, still Espin, it is literally a radical risk from the Latin radix, root. Openness to the mystery must also defy our certainties regarding the mystery and our own openness to it. Openness, Espin goes on, to the mystery is neither key nor guarantee of the encounter with the mystery. At most, openness is just that, a dangerous openness, which is an attitude and a risk before it is a condition, close quote. It is that radical sense of openness that comes from the desert, I think. The radical openness that Jesus experienced there, an openness that took him to teach and heal at the margins of his society, to proclaim the good news of God's compassionate love, an openness that ultimately took him to the cross. It challenges his followers, including those in the United States today, to acknowledge the truth that Jesus as God is a God of the vanquished, not the victors. It is a risk that Christians claim God vindicates in Jesus's resurrection. But here's the kicker. Do we really? It's kind of like what I'm grappling with right now. So moving on then to the second moment, the desert. I care about the desert because of a problem that I'm grappling with in my research. Since 2015, as was shared earlier, I have focused my research on the advancement of theological ethical analysis of migration. My aim has been to draw from the wisdom of the Catholic intellectual tradition and what it offers to create more just immigration systems, and to nurture that tradition in turn so that it has a greater ability to do so in increasingly pluralistic and interdependent societies, including ours. In that vein, the history of US immigration policy and our ongoing immigration debate has led me to argue elsewhere that it is necessary to understand that migration binds immigrant and citizen together. From a theological ethical perspective, that relationship has moral significance that tends to be lost and ignored. Now, why focus on the relationship between immigrants and citizens? One of the more recent interdisciplinary theories of migration, one that is the closest, I think, to a Christian anthropology of the person, has gained currency among migration scholars. It assumes that immigrants are not just rational, but also relational agents. Called migration system theory, it suggests, in the words of Castles and Miller, migration scholars, quote, that migratory movements generally arise from the existence of prior links between sending and receiving countries based on colonization, political influence, trade, investment, and cultural ties, end quote. A series of macro and micro structures from a set of countries interact through intermediate mechanisms called mesostructures to meet the needs of multiple actors, including migrants, their loved ones, and their employers across the migration systems that they share. So for example, the migration system that the United States, Mexico, and Central America's Northern Triangle share, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the relationships that US citizens and the citizens of those countries have shaped wantonly or not then have moral value. So what is the problem? An inability by US Catholics and other Christians, I think, to see the reality of the ties that bind them. I began to appreciate this in the late 90s and early aughts at the desert in Mexicali. So this is the desert that's right between Mexicali and the Imperial Valley on the other side of the border, when I worked for the Mexican Catholic Conference of Bishops. So here, let me just share two photos first. So at the time I was in my early to mid 20s, and at the time when I was working for the Mexican Catholic Conference of Bishops, I went all over the US-Mexico border, crossing at every single port of entry save one. And when I went back home to Mexicali, I caught a ride with what at the time was a human rights group from the Mexican government that were called Grupo Beta. And I went on a ride along all from the desert in Yuma all the way to the mountains coming up to San Diego, just through the desert on the Mexican side. No markings, not like anything. At one point, our vehicle was actually nearly attacked by the Mexican military. That was kind of an experience because they thought we were smugglers. So we're going on the pickup. And as we get closer to the mountains, that are coming up to San Diego, we come up against this obelisk here. So I think most of you have seen these before. They are international markers. So at the time, we didn't really have a wall. That was the only way that we knew that the US was over there on that side. So I saw this, but at the same time, I wasn't just interested in seeing the desert like this. And by the way, I mean, if you've been to Mexicali in this part of the desert in July, August, September, it gets up to 120 degrees. It's pretty hot. So I'm there and I'm just looking at reality like this. But at the same time, I went there, I wanted to go there because of this. Now, my apologies for the quality of the pictures, and this data is already old, but it's the data, it's the reality that took me to the desert. So there was an organization at the time, it still exists, but it no longer has this project. It's called the California Rural Legal Assistance Fund. And I had met a Chicana advocate there who started looking for the data because she was hearing and learning from clients that they were dying, that their loved ones were dying on the desert. And there was no information on who had died, where they had died, and so on. So a group of NGOs at the time, led by her, started putting together this data. And I mean, look here, right? This is Mexicali right there. So this is all where migrants were dying. This is where the bodies were found. Now, this is the reality that I found at the desert. So beyond this, I was worried about this. This is what I wanted to try and understand, to see. So during that time, whenever I came to the US side and met with fellow US Catholics and other Christians as well, here's what I found. I found that a fear of running out of resources, of actually going hungry, of thirst, even with the Colorado River, informed a lot of the thinking at the parishes and elsewhere. I found self-centeredness and pride. an honest belief in American exceptionalism, an honest belief in the idea that America is the city upon a hill that shines as a beacon for all. Something that I might add is actually an idea from St. Augustine. It was never meant to be about a particular country, including ours, as much as I love the US. It was actually meant to talk about the city of God. So that self-centeredness that I found. And then finally, power. At the time, I was interviewed by by press from Italy who were visiting Mexicali, and just they were stunned by the border. And I think at that point, it had been 10 years or so since the Berlin Wall had fallen. Berlin Wall fell in 1989, right? So it was 1999 or so, right before 2000. And they asked me, Victor, do you think this wall is going to fall? And I said, unfortunately, no. I think the Berlin Wall fell because it was an ideologically constructed, it's a wall that represented ideology and politics, something that can be very abstract in a way. But unfortunately, this wall, and I mean, now it's gotten worse. This war is responding to socioeconomic fears and concerns. There's money behind it. So unfortunately, I don't see the president of the US or the president of Mexico or Canada, standing across the wall, even though Pope Francis kind of did this and say, Mr. Biden, tear down this wall. I don't see it, because I think of our fear of running out of resources, of our self-centeredness and pride, and because of our power. Very real problems and issues. So in these final 2 minutes or so, moving on to religion and the real then. So look, I'm not a scholar of religion. There are multiple definitions for religions. The classic definition is that religions bind a people together. Now, my concern is that my religion, Catholicism in the US, and more broadly Christianity in the US, has failed to withstand the temptation of hunger, pride, and power in the context of the immigration debate. Why does this matter? And here I'm just going to share 2 insights that I'm still wrapping my mind around, and I welcome conversation on these as well. First insight is from a scholar of spirituality. His name is Philip Sheldrake, from a book he wrote a while back titled Spaces for the Sacred Place, Memory, and Identity. He argues, and here I'm quoting him, that space does not exist as a subjective thing. It is subjectively perceived and experienced differently depending on perspective. Now, theorists are now much more inclined to say, he writes, that a sense of place actually precedes and creates a sense of space. Space is an abstract analytical concept, whereas place is always tangible, physical, specific, and relational, including the desert. And he goes on to quote a theologian named Walter Brueggemann. I'm not going to get into that right now. But this idea that place is relational. It calls for relation. It binds us together somehow. Now, why am I curious about the desert now? And why one of these days I would love to do what you did and maybe take some of my students to the desert, but just maybe a different kind of desert, probably closer to the border. I read an article recently by Megan Garber from The Atlantic, and it's an article titled, We're Already Living in the Metaverse, from The Atlantic. And there she's getting into just how we're now at a point in our history where technology has taken us in such a direction that we seem to be escaping reality. And I wonder if much of this is what's happening with, frankly, an immigration debate, even among Catholics and other Christians, that seems to have been stuck. So she writes, in the future, the writers warned that we will surrender ourselves to our entertainment. We will become so distracted and dazed by our fictions that we'll lose our sense of what is real. We will make our escape so comprehensive that we cannot free ourselves from them. The result will be a populace that forgets how to think. We need the liberal arts. How to empathize with one another, even how to govern and be governed. That future has already arrived, she argues. We live our lives, willingly or not, within the metaverse. Then she goes on. We might be engaging in what the psychologist John Suller has described as the online disinhibition effect, the tendency for people in digital spaces to act in ways they never would offline. I've received emails from students like that. That disinhibition might originate in an assumption that the digital world differs from the quote real world, or in a sense that online interactions amount to a low stakes game. But it can lead people to treat, and this is what worries me, it can lead people to treat the humans on the other side of the screen as not human, as not real at all. Disinhibition may begin in the offline world, but it doesn't stay there. So in conclusion, again, I confess that I offered no thesis statement. Instead, what I brought to you is simply an honest grappling with the temptations that Jesus successfully faced at the desert, but that his disciples in the US, in the context of the immigration debate, seem to have not. So the temptations of hunger or fear of hunger, of power, and of self-centeredness and pride. Thank you.
Thank you for those really thought-provoking words. We have beautifully and the questions and discussion. Anyone who's looking at I'll be happy to start one thing. Just something else I think you mentioned about the war, both of you, this question, and just to hear a little bit more from both of you about how you thought the concept of sacred, what it encompasses, and how you see it manifesting in that desert region, the desert region.
Well, to me, the concept of the sacred is very simple. It's all about orientation, how your life is oriented. And that's how I see it. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as there's a sense of orientation that gives you guidance. That's how I teach it. When I think of the desert, I think of, places that I'm most familiar with, which would be like Arizona and New Mexico. I spent 10 years with penitentes in New Mexico who were flagellants. And they were always despised because they were so different. And it was the people like Mary Austin and what's the name of Willa Cather and all these folks that came from the outside to really negate what they had done. And so I'm always looking at it from that perspective because there's so many other voices that need to be heard. And it's a different interpretation of the desert than how we understand it. This book, I taught it at a small little community called Guadalupe. It's right out of Tempe, still a Yaqui community. And it was treated so differently there than if I would have taught it somewhere else, because they understood it and they lived it. And that's what first got me thinking more about this, because it made sense to them. It wasn't this, as we've been hearing, this kind of stark, uninhabitable space, but actually being able to live one with the landscape and respecting it and being able to, so that's kind of my thoughts.
And for me, when I think of the sacred, I think of Christ. I mean, it's the fully human, fully divine. That moment, that place where we're able to see and become more of divinity in us and of humanity in the divine. That just draws me deeply. In the context of the desert, I find the desert every time that I visit, or when I'm particularly at the edges of of the border region around Mexicali, it's both an attractive and a scary place. And I think its attraction and the fear and awe that it inspires in me has to do with the lack of distraction. And I wonder honestly if I mean, it wasn't like Jesus was the first one to go to the desert, right? He was doing something that many others had already been doing within Judaism for centuries by that point. So I think there's just something about the desert, the wilderness, that allows us to cut through the noise in ways that are revealing in the sense of divinity, but also, híjole, en español es desnudez.
¿Cómo?
Desnudez.
Como nudity?
Yeah, like nakedness, like
Nakedness.
the nakedness of the human as well. Just this transparency, that,
Stripping.
the stripping away, I think, that the desert just has. Okay.
Kind of two things. I think, Alberto, it's curious that you were thinking about Mendes, and I was thinking of another short story of his, that the desert, becomes inhabited by our ancestors. So I'm struck by kind of, we have had some folks in this series talk about the absence of the desert and kind of the lack. But we've also had several speakers who talked about the generative, creative power of the desert. And I think it's really fascinating how you've both been speaking of the space in that way. Alberto, you're yours in terms of contested space and physically yours in terms of the sacred and how it's reception. I was wondering if both of you could talk a bit about kind of how just a bit more about the creative or generative space, and how you're thinking of it right now. And I think, I don't know, I have thoughts about that, but I think both of you also mentioned kind of hunger in different ways, but in maybe a collective way, and so maybe that might be a way to enter into that.
Come you.
Primero.
No, you're first. This time you're first. I'll be second.
Ándale, pues. Oh my goodness. I mean, what I struggle with the desert and the hunger and the generativeness as well in there is, in the context of migration, the desert is a brutal, deadly place. So I'm also very scared and afraid of romanticizing death. So that there is this question of how, the question is, are migrants dying or are we murdering them? A migration scholar, Wayne Cornelius, argued that the data showed, and this is already back in the late 90s, that the data showed that migrants' deaths were happening at the border, quote, as a direct consequence and effect of US immigration policy. I knew that because when I worked for the bishops, we had received a leaked memo from, at the time, the US Immigration and Naturalization Service. And it was a memo from the policymakers that designed all the operations that sealed the border. And the memo had a paragraph in there that there was the intended effect of killing people, with the idea that migrants would find crossing the border so scary and so deadly that they would rationally stop coming. They wouldn't be that hungry. Well, they were wrong. That in terms of reality. Again, in terms of the scholarship though, again, the relationships know no bounds. The border, as real as it is in the context of politics and socioeconomic issues and so on, at the same time, I mean, people are still crossing it illegally. It's not gonna stop. the relationships that bind us and the hunger are stronger than the fear of Americans that are desiring to control this border, I think. Again, I'm still grappling with this. It's still an ongoing article. I don't know yet for sure. Alberto.
I think that part of our work in ethnic studies is what we call recovery work. We're trying to either reclaim or unearth things that we don't know. So these stories that I shared with you today is an attempt to do that. How to reclaim the space that has been redefined and changed so many ways. And if you look at, following up what Victor's saying, if you look at this concept of pilgrimage, this is an act of pilgrimage, but it gets politicized with an international border. You know, those of you who know about Juan Soldado and Tijuana is very important to this movement, as crazy as it may be, but yet it's very, very important. So I have to say, and this is when I get into my touchy-feely mode, that beyond that recovery, there's also a spirit of healing. And it's a spirit of reclaiming and dealing with intergenerational trauma with regards to communities, because we continue to live with those realities. And that to me is what drives me in terms of my own story, my own history, because it's fragmented. We don't have all the parts. We only know little pieces. So in trying to reclaim these stories, it's an attempt to try to tell that story, even though if it's only partial. And I wanted to pick up on the deaths. You know, now it's not the desert, it's the pangas in the water. And so that's another narrative that's starting to form. I just wrote an editorial for the paper on Friday, and I gave recognition to Tlaloc, the rain god, because from the perspective of the indigenous people, Tlaloc will save those people who die a watery death and die a dangerous death, and he'll take them to the land of flower and song. So there's other interpretations of what's happened, because all we see them as smugglers and as people who die, not recognizing their names, not recognizing what they've done. And it seems the only stories we hear are the people who get caught. The other stories we don't know. You know, my mentor, who was a scholar in immigration, used to always say, Immigration Border Patrol always says, well, we caught one, but 4 got away. Like, how do they know that? But this is always the narrative, you know, that you hear. So that's what I think.
And it's not touchy-feely. It's
Oh,
integration.
I mean, you know, middle-aged Chicano talking about emotions. It's crazy.
Yeah,
It's important to me. Students get kind of scared. What? Are you the new Oprah?
And that might be the creativity topic that to me at least, seems like a spirit about. And so when I was initially hearing that, I was thinking, well, in the desert, it's a great illustration, has very, very distant horizons. There's not an abundance of weather. And so it sort of maybe opens things up for the mind a little bit, but also occurs to me that the Victor said something fine, is that the definition of sublime, right, from a Burkean perspective, from a Burkean perspective, there's an element of danger to it. And so what I'm wondering is there a productive discomfort that the desert produces that you realize we produce twice, but is there a discomfort that the desert produces that leads people to move forward in creativity and spirituality in particular ways that other kinds of environments simply don't have?
Well, I mean, as it relates to the desert, like I was trying to make the point, it's all about a sense of home and a homeland. And a homeland is going to be exactly what you're saying, because everybody's trying to find a homeland. That's why we have Palestinians killing Jews and Jews killing Palestinians. I mean, it's all about that space that's yours. And what I'll say, which is a little bit off, but I think it's very important, come down to Chicano Park with me and I'll show you a space that is one of the noisiest in the entire country because of the thousands of vehicles that cross that space every day. So that's dangerous. We have the highest rates of children asthma in the entire state of California, and we're the third in terms of air pollution. So that makes you creative because you have to figure out how to live within that reality. And when you look at San Diegans outside of the 92103 zip code, they don't care. They don't really care because this community has the worst problems. And so I see that as a metaphor for the desert because it's a very serious issue and it's man-made. Okay, it's freeways and it's industry. It's contaminants that continue to destroy this community, but nobody seems to worry about that. And that to me is a desert. But you live it and you risk it daily trying to understand it because it's what you have. That's what I'm trying to say. Some of the stuff I said might have been romanticized, but it was the reality that the people had to live with because this is where they were from. So that's how I would see it.
I mean, I think it goes to the openness to risk that is being picked up in terms of what prayer, like true prayer, not rote memorizing, but actual, prayer involves. And I think that's what attracted Jesus and John and countless others, before them and after them to the desert, because, I mean, again, it strips everything away. I mean, I think in the Christian tradition, and this is, I wish Peter was here. I mean, the monasteries. In early Christianity, the first 6 centuries, the tradition of first before the monastery was the hermits, and then the monasteries, come out of precisely looking for this kind of place and staying in that kind of place. In some cases, for example, the case of the Benedictines, for their entire life. So I think there's still something to be said about that risk taking that is at the desert. And again, just to take us back to the Gospel of Matthew, like this, it's very interesting. The text is very explicit, at least in that particular gospel. Jesus was fine for 40 days or nearly 40 days. He had enough to eat. I mean, I think John and company, I mean, they knew what to eat in the wilderness. He was fine. He hadn't died of hunger. He was fine. He just got hungry at the end. And I think that hunger came from the risk taking that he was willing to take. That, again, I don't know if US Catholics and other Christians are there anymore. I don't know if we've become so middle class that we're risk averse now, even in our spirituality, even when we think of migration.
Yep.
Yeah.
Once you're comfortable.
You don't want to go back. Yeah.
And you also actually lose interest in examining things that are maybe, but everything's, I don't know, I got my CBS, my sports, my TV shows, I can get my food.
I can get the metaverse. I can go in. Fun, yeah. Yeah.
Experience when you've gone back to the streets to get going is recently, but one of them commented they couldn't quite feel that feeling of the sublime, vulnerability, because they felt so safe. And I'm running around with satellite shot right here.
Next time.
If you want to make them
Yes.
like that show.
Yes, Susie.
Thanks to both of you. It was really, really wonderful, to hear you both, on these topics, but it's, difficult to hear a lot of this too. But I love, Victor, this connection that you're making between the immigrant and the citizen. And it seems to me that this is something that America as a nation just never talks about. It's sort of this us and them rather than the binding. And we're all immigrants except for the indigenous peoples. And so, I mean, my people are all came here in the 20th century, and most of them were illegal. They were just white, and so didn't have to face the dangers of that come with not being documented. So it's hard. I think we're a nation of immigrants on the one hand, but we don't think of ourselves as that in terms of what you're aiming for in terms of this finding. And I just wondered if you could say more about that. Is there a way that that might be the language that we could adopt to be able to talk about these political things?
I'm looking. This is why. So as an ethicist, I've turned to spirituality and more embodied practices of encounter, including perhaps in the desert, to try and jar us out from this slumber. But the effects of having forgotten being an immigrant people are real. Within the Catholic Church, for example, most white Catholics or European American Catholics are by now third or fourth generation Catholics. The memory of migration, it's gone. It has no effects, or it's a misremembering of what actually happened. Like, we actually did not have an immigration law up until the early 1900s. Before then, though, you know, we also had different ways of keeping people out, but migrants always found a way around them. But we misremember this. We just forget or choose to forget. So now that most migrants, including within the Catholic Church, are Latinos, no, they're too different. Now, what's interesting is that the data shows also that a large majority of migrants, both undocumented and permanent residents, a large majority have been here for over 20 years. So imagine in 20 years, people fall in love, people fall out of love, people have kids, people adopt kids. I mean, it gets messy. And yet that part of the relationality gets lost. I'll give you a quick example. When I lived in South Bend, Indiana, we would get the newspaper from local newspaper from towns further south from South Bend or further east. And there were these ongoing stories on the news about townspeople coming to the defense of undocumented immigrants that have been in their communities for the last 5-10 years. Some of them even married to European American, spouses. And whenever they interviewed, the people from the town, and again, usually very right-wing, sometimes hardcore, so they would say, well, isn't this the illegal that you say that we should be deporting? And the answer would undoubtedly always go kind of like this. No, not this one. This is Juan. Everyone knows Juan. He's a pillar of the community. There was a fire at the school and he fed the fire. I mean, it was just so interesting. Not this one. All of the other bad hombres, yes, but not this one. So there's still something to be said about embodiment that I'm worried about with the metaverse in terms of, is the metaverse diminishing our already weak ability to be compassionate to a fellow human being? I would like to say that it won't, but I think it looks like it might.
the metaverse perspective. I mean, I think it's easy to kind of blame, especially entertainment media or media, for a lot of the ills or that it's too distracting. But also, if you think about the way technology or media can actually tell stories that create empathy. So, for example, we just had this the Latino Film Festival. You know, there's tons of movies and stories that are told not from the Hollywood mainstream lens. So I just I would worry about playing it all. Yeah, but there's definitely like commercial, entertainment, mainstream, and there's ways that you can caveat. But I think there's a place for stories to be told in an alternative way.
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, because yeah. Well, it's just, I mean, Catholicism, I mean, and you know, there's this both and, it's never either or. And I don't think it's either technology or no technology. I think there has to be some place in the middle, but I just honestly don't know where it is. I hope that y'all can tell us. Yeah. Yeah.
I see a question related to what you were saying, Richard, about the forgetfulness of migration and the loss of migration, and also related a little bit to what you were saying earlier, and very related to what Alberto was talking about too, about the story, contested stories, or the story of the victor versus the conqueror. And I wonder sometimes if it's not just that we've forgotten the migrant narrative of our ancestors or countries, but it's also that the narrative of the U.S. has typically been one of the underdog and of resistance, right? And so it's this over-identification with, well, you know, my family did it the right way, and pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, and I have the American dream, and I'm using all of these very related phrases and quotation marks, as a way to turn. I mean, I think that was part of the history of that is part of the history of our country that's woven together and narrated precisely to reify the white supremacy and racial and class differences. So I don't know. I was thinking about that as we were thinking about what is the memory that we've forgotten, and what's the narrative that we want forward, and how do we use this to contest the historical narrative?
No, she's asking you. You're the expert.
I mean, within theological ethics and theology more broadly, there is a movement by Latinx and other theologians, particularly from the global South, to decenter the narratives and to decenter the language that is being used to reflect on all these questions. In the context of the U.S., I hope that things will get better, but look, I was invited to a panel the day after January 6th. I don't even have to say the year, like right the day after January 6th. We're meeting for the annual meeting of the Society of Christian Ethics. And I remember there was this palpable fear of an awareness that many white Americans, or more specifically European Americans, would rather burn this country to the ground than share its dreams and its hopes with people who did not look like them. And frankly, I'm still not sure that that part of the population has made up their mind. My hope would be that those who self-identify as Christian, including Catholic, when that part of the population reconsiders. But I don't know. This is where, for me, the subversive hope needs to come in. So at this point, I want to hope, but I don't know. Alberto, ¿cómo lo ves?
I mean, when you're talking, I think that there's other traditions that could be just as helpful, and that would be Judaism. I'm thinking in particular, our buddy, who worked with King, ¿cómo se llama? Heschel. Heschel works
Rabbi
is,
Heschel,
is all about what you're talking about. In order to see the reality that you speak of, and in order to see God's plan working, he needs people to do that.
Yeah.
It's not just this narrative of the supreme being,
Yeah.
but it's integrated in that understanding of how we do it. Going back to your point, Amanda, I think that a struggle that I will always have as someone who was born in this country is that we are always categorized, and when I see we, I mean Latinos, are always categorized as arriving and just becoming.
Mm.
We don't really have a presence, like, as we've seen that done so well now with the African-American community. I think the Floyd killing has allowed the African-American community to sort of reclaim space and tell new stories that make them legitimate in this country. And we don't have
We
that.
don't have-
And I don't think we ever will. I mean,
We're too diverse.
I don't know if it's that. I mean, it might be, but I just think, because growing up on the border here, I knew the tensions between people coming from Tijuana and people who were, but we would like beat up the kids from Tijuana. I mean, I'm being honest with you. And they would beat us up, and then we would want to fight with them. But I mean, that was the reality. Hey, ese vato viene de Tijuana, ándale, es un junior.
Sí.
That was the reality. And yet, I don't see that changing. We're always arriving, we're always becoming. We're not here. We're not legitimate people in this nation. We don't have a story to tell. Ours comes from somewhere else and we're bringing it. And it reminds me of when you had the quote unquote darker skinned Cubans coming in the 80s, how different they were treated from the Cubanos who came initially. So, I mean, again, that's the reality for me. And what you learn, like myself, I learned how to navigate those spaces. I know how to, I know how to deal with that in Tijuana, and I know how to deal with it here. And you're just trying to fit in wherever you can. And I'm someone that grew up with light skin, so I was able to do some very interesting things that my colleagues have not been able to do. And I'm male, and I'm tall. Those things are very, very important in being in the society. We did it. We're gonna go on the road.